All right, let's start with the big story that we're tracking on WION at this hour, where the first police-sanctioned mass rally in Hong Kong since August is presently marching across the city. Now, the organizers are calling this the last chance for the Chief Executive, Carrie Lam, to actually give in and concede to their demands. The permission for this protest march was granted to the Civil Human Rights Front. Now, you might remember them as the organizers of the million-strong marches back in the month of June. The protesters have started their march from Victoria Park in the shopping district till Charter Road, which lies in the heart of the city. And WION's correspondent Grace Lee is presently tracking all the action from the heart of Hong Kong, and she's joining us live from Hong Kong now. Good afternoon to you, Grace. Give us a sense of what is playing out on the streets of Hong Kong today. What does this march seek to accomplish?
Well, it's a largely peaceful march. As you can see behind me, protesters are rallying, and the scene is very reminiscent of the kind of protest scene we saw in June and, in the summer when protests first kicked off. We saw a lot of peaceful protesters, and here we're seeing a lot of children, elderly folks, all coming out to show their support for the protest movement. They're hoping to, like you said, send a final message to Carrie Lam and her government that Hong Kong's protesters are still fighting for those 5 demands that they started out with. And of course, they want a free election. They want accountability from the government and from the police force, as we see increasingly violent clashes between protesters and police. These are all things they've been asking for months. And the tipping point really was during the local elections, where we saw a pro-democratic sweep here in Hong Kong, as well as the 2 bills in the U.S. being passed for pro-democratic rights in Hong Kong as well. Protesters were hoping for some kind of answer from Carrie Lam at that point. She has still said that she will not give in to protesters' demands. And so they're hoping that with this big of a rally, with this big of a march, where they show that, yes, they are still marching peacefully, they can hopefully get an answer out of Carrie Lam.
Absolutely, indeed. And also, this is for the first time since August that the police have actually given these protesters permission to take out this protest march. There's been a change of guard at the top of the police hierarchy in Hong Kong. Are we likely to see a difference in terms of the tactics that are used by the police in dealing with the protesters?
Well, today, noticeably, there's a much smaller police presence here on the ground. Increasingly, we had seen larger and larger police presence at these marches, and we've seen police fire off tear gas in the first couple of minutes of these marches, making sure that some of them can't even begin. And so today, we're seeing a noticeable return to calm here from both the protesters and the police. Police have said that they are watching out for any kind of, violence from the protesters' side. They had put up the flags for tear gas earlier on before the march even began, but it seems that they are standing pretty far away from the protesters. It is like you said, a march that they've approved, and so protesters are really hoping that this will end as peacefully as it started.
Absolutely, indeed. And just before I let you go, Grace, Beijing has had a very interesting take on all of these protests. They've made certain disconcerting noises that if these protests don't end, then Beijing could step in. So at this point of time, the protesters have not given up on any of their demands. Has there been a change in terms of how Beijing is viewing these protests?
Well, Beijing has obviously given a couple of responses since the protests began. Most noticeably, according to a recent Reuters report, they've set up a crisis center in the mainland to deal with the Hong Kong protests. And of course, they've said multiple times that they're concerned with foreign powers interfering in its internal affairs, meaning that they suspect that the U.S. has a lot to do with these protests here in Hong Kong. They've given stern warnings to both the U.S. and to the protesters in Hong Kong. That hasn't stopped the U.S. from passing those 2 pro-democratic bills, and it hasn't stopped protesters from coming out onto the streets, like you see here behind me today. So it seems their warnings don't really mean much to these protesters. They're still standing strong.
All right, we'll have to leave it there. Thank you very much indeed, Grace, for joining us and getting us all those updates from Hong Kong. We'll, of course, come back to you as the story unfolds through the day.